They've got so much to say now. Why did they not, Mr. Speaker, why did they not implement a single recommendation in the 14 years they had in office? We're taking forward those. There are recommendations already in place about the change that needs to be taken. They sat on a shelf under the last government. We are acting on them. We are providing for local inquiries, and we're investing more.
Political battle. Brave MP promised to wage war against Starmer's government after his illegal deal with the UDOT in a moment of bold defiance that sent ripples across the political spectrum. A Conservative member of Parliament took a defiant stand in the House of Commons, warning Labour leader Keir Starmer about the perceived betrayal behind his stance on a future deal with the European Union. The MP, in a pointed address, delivered a sharp rebuke that captured the essence of long-simmering discontent among Brexit supporters and reignited the debate over the United Kingdom's sovereignty in a post-Brexit era. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," the MP began, his voice resolute and his tone unapologetic. "Can I just point out to the Prime Minister that nothing can undo the fact that 17.5 million people voted leave?" He paused for effect, allowing the weight of the figure to sink in before continuing. "They voted to take back control of our laws and to stop paying money to the EU." The MP underscored the democratic mandate that had driven the Brexit vote in 2016, contrasting it with the most recent general election outcome. That was a considerably larger vote than the 9.7 million who voted Labour at the last election. He stated, "And now he is submitting to EU regulations without any control. And he is giving money, starting to pay money back to the European Union. What followed was a direct accusation of political betrayal. He's giving up control over our laws and restoring payments to the European Union. He will pay a bitter political price for this betrayal." His remarks were met with murmurs across the chamber, reflecting both support and consternation. The MP continued, invoking what he described as red lines that had been clearly established post-Brexit: no rejoining of the European Union, no single market, no customs union, and no return of freedom of movement. These, he asserted, were non-negotiable principles. Mr. Speaker, he knows full well that we had a red line about not rejoining the no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement. It was a line in the sand that many Brexit supporters still hold sacred, and one they believe is being steadily eroded. We were told it was impossible to negotiate a better deal with the EU with those red lines. We've just done it, he insisted. We've also showed that we are outside the EU, because he will appreciate that having a deal with India and the US is inconsistent with membership of the EU. Could be no better evidence that we're not going back into the EU. The MP urged colleagues not to be distracted by ongoing negotiations with the EU, suggesting that such discussions were either irrelevant or misleading in the broader context of national sovereignty. "Ignore these negotiations," he stated bluntly. On that basis, I know he understands that very, very well. I'm surprised at the way he puts his question, turning his attention to immigration. The MP critiqued what he described as a failure to maintain border control post-Brexit. As for control of borders honestly, it went from quadrupling net migration after Brexit to nearly 1 million. That wasn't controlling our borders. It was a complete lack of control on the other side. The issue of immigration remains one of the most emotive and politically charged aspects of the Brexit debate. The original Leave campaign heavily emphasized restoring control over Britain's borders, and the MP's remarks served as a reminder that many voters still feel those promises have not been fulfilled on the matter of financial contributions to the EU. The MP sought to clarify what he framed as misleading claims. "Mr. Speaker, on the question of payments, I do think it's important to appreciate that we've achieved unprecedented access to EU markets without the budgetary payments of member states. That is an incredible achievement, He elaborated on the specific terms under the Sanitary and Phytosanitary SPS Agreement, which facilitates trade in food and agricultural products between the UK and the EU. The only payment under the SPS agreement are administrative costs to support the relevant cost of implementing and administering the scheme, he explained. For schemes and payments where it's in our national interest, we will negotiate proportionate contributions. He also referenced UK participation in specific EU-led initiatives, such as research and innovation programs. As already happens under the deal negotiated by them, for example, in relation to R&D and into Horizon. He knows all that very well. His remarks drew sharp lines between pragmatic cooperation and ideological compromise, by suggesting that targeted collaboration with the EU in mutually beneficial areas does not equate to relinquishing sovereignty. He positioned the government's current path as consistent with Brexit principles. Yet, in pointing fingers at Labour's approach, he also made it clear that a return to deeper alignment with Brussels would be met with fierce resistance. Though the address was aimed at Keir Starmer, the MP's words echoed far beyond the chamber. They resonated with a segment of the electorate that feels increasingly alienated by what they see as a slow creep back toward EU integration. His use of terms like betrayal, red lines, and bitter political price left little ambiguity about the stakes involved. Notably, the MP's challenge came at a time when Labour had been quietly signaling a desire to improve relations with the European Union, potentially reopening dialogue on regulatory alignment, market access, and cooperative mechanisms in areas such as trade and defense. For many pro-Brexit voices, such overtures represent not only a policy shift, but a fundamental challenge to the 2016 referendum's outcome. Meanwhile, the government has continued to stress the benefits of its independent trade policy, highlighting agreements with non-EU countries as evidence of Brexit's potential. Deals with India and the United States were held up as case studies in global engagement unconstrained by EU membership. Still, critics argue that these deals have yet to deliver substantial economic benefits. The MP's remarks, while impassioned and rooted in principle, also reflected ongoing tensions within the Conservative Party itself. There is an internal struggle between those who view Brexit as a settled issue and others who believe its mission is incomplete and still vulnerable to reversal. The Labour leader, in his own public statements, has emphasized pragmatism. He has sought to distinguish between rejoining the EU and rebuilding relationships with European neighbors. However, the fine line between cooperation and alignment is a political minefield. For many voters, any steps that suggest movement toward EU norms or frameworks are seen as backsliding. The MP's speech, therefore, served as both a warning and a rallying cry. It challenged Labour's direction, critiqued government shortcomings, and reminded Parliament of the magnitude of the Brexit vote. He will pay a bitter political price for this betrayal, he repeated, the phrase hanging in the air like a foreboding prophecy. As the chamber settled, the speaker moved on, but the message had already landed. The underlying sentiment, the belief that Brexit must be defended from dilution, remains potent. For millions of Britons who cast their ballots in favor of leave, the question is not whether Britain should rejoin the EU. For them, the real question is whether the political establishment truly respects the mandate they gave nearly a decade ago. In the aftermath of the session, the video clip of the MP's warning rapidly circulated across social media platforms. Commenters from across the political divide weighed in, some applauding the MP's candor, others accusing him of stoking division. Regardless of viewpoint, one thing was clear: the speech had struck a nerve. Before closing, the MP's team urged viewers to like and share the video so that it reaches a wider audience. They also encouraged people to comment with their thoughts, an appeal that reflects a broader strategy of direct engagement with the public, bypassing traditional media filters. In many ways, this moment was emblematic of the new political reality. In post-Brexit Britain, parliamentary speeches are no longer just for the record. They are content. They are weapons in the ongoing culture and political wars that define this era. For supporters of Brexit, the speech was a reaffirmation. For opponents, it was a warning sign that Brexit's political grip remains unshaken, and for Keir Starmer, it was a clear message that any steps toward closer EU ties will not go unnoticed or unchallenged. The MP's forceful critique did more than just draw a line in the sand. It reopened a national conversation that many believed was beginning to settle. His intervention made it unmistakably clear that for a substantial portion of the population and Parliament alike, Brexit is not merely an event that has happened. It is an ongoing process, a project that must be constantly defended, preserved, and, in their view, fulfilled in both letter and spirit. In the days following the speech, analysts and commentators debated whether the MP's remarks reflected widespread discontent or the views of a vocal minority within the Conservative Party. Some political observers saw the statement as a preemptive strike aimed at Labour's growing confidence in potentially revisiting elements of the Brexit arrangement under the guise of pragmatic cooperation. Political strategist Olivia Renshaw commented, "This speech was as much a warning shot to Sir Keir Starmer as it was a reminder to the Prime Minister and the broader Conservative leadership that the Brexit coalition is not to be taken for granted. There's a base out there passionate, motivated, and still suspicious of anything that smells like EU alignment. For Starmer, the challenge lies in navigating a path that balances improved R." There were also quiet murmurs within Labour about the need to clarify the party's stance. While Starmer has ruled out rejoining the EU, ambiguity around regulatory alignment and trade cooperation continues to fuel suspicion among voters who once abandoned Labour over Brexit. Some within the party are urging a clearer communication strategy to avoid giving opponents easy ammunition. For now, the MP's words remain etched in the record, part warning, part manifesto, and part rallying cry. He did not speak with the polished detachment of a career diplomat, but with the intensity of someone who believes the stakes remain existential. His reference to a bitter political price was not just aimed at Labour. It was a reminder to all parties that in a democracy, betrayal, or even the perception of it, carries consequences. In many ways, the speech underscored a fundamental tension in British politics, the desire for sovereignty versus the necessity of partnership. How that tension is resolved, or whether it can be resolved, will define the next chapter in Britain's post-Brexit journey. What is clear from this moment in the Commons is that the ghosts of Brexit are not fading. If anything, they are becoming more vocal, and in that chamber, beneath the weight of history and the scrutiny of millions watching from afar, one MP stood to remind the nation that the story of Brexit is still being written. As the political fallout from the MP's speech continued to develop, its echoes reached beyond Westminster and into the towns, cities, and rural constituencies where the Brexit debate first caught fire. Local radio hosts opened their lines to impassioned callers. Newspapers published letters from both furious critics and grateful supporters, and online forums saw renewed activity from users once deeply engaged in the referendum. What had begun as a parliamentary statement transformed into a wider national moment, a flashpoint reigniting the passions of a country still deeply divided over what Brexit truly meant and what it should look like moving forward. At its core, the speech tapped into an emotional undercurrent that has never really left the British political psyche. For many, Brexit was a singular moment of empowerment, a rare occasion when the electorate felt they had genuinely reshaped the national course. When that moment is perceived as being undermined, whether by technical negotiations, quiet regulatory shifts, or political ambiguity, it provokes a powerful emotional response. The MP gave voice to that response. This sense of power and ownership is central to the Brexit legacy. Many Leave voters have said they didn't just vote against the EU, they voted for something. Control, transparency, accountability. When politicians appear to reverse or dilute those outcomes under the pretext of technical necessity or economic realism, that original sense of victory begins to feel hollow. The MP's words gave weight to those anxieties, positioning himself not just as a legislator, but as a guardian of that popular mandate. In policy circles, however, the speech prompted concern about the long-term implications of such rigid political framing. Experts argue that framing any renewed cooperation with the EU as betrayal leaves little room for rational debate. Trade analysts pointed out that global supply chains and international regulatory standards are realities that every nation, including those outside the EU, must deal with. As the Commons returned to business, the aftershock of the MP's address still lingered. His remarks weren't just a critique, they were a challenge. A challenge to Labour's evolving policy. A challenge to the government's own inconsistencies. And perhaps most significantly, a challenge to anyone in Parliament who believed Brexit was now a settled matter, safely filed away in the archives of recent history. It is not. At least, not for the millions who, like that MP, still see it as a defining mission unfinished, under threat, and worth fighting for again. The MP's address did more than reawaken an old debate. It spotlighted a deeper concern that resonates with many in the electorate, the feeling that the democratic will expressed in the 2016 referendum is being eroded by political maneuvering and bureaucratic drift. For those who supported Brexit, particularly in regions that had long felt ignored by Westminster, that vote was not just about the European Union, it was about reclaiming agency. It was about asserting that the people's voice mattered more than elite consensus. The fear that this message is now being sidelined fuels not only political frustration, but cultural resentment in the political corridors of Westminster. There is a growing awareness that the Brexit question is not settled by legal documents or diplomatic agreements. It is settled by trust. And trust, once broken, is hard to repair. That is what the MP was warning about in his remarks. The sharp language, the warning of a political price to be paid, was not mere rhetoric. It was a signal to colleagues on both sides of the aisle that the memory of that vote remains vivid and unresolved for millions. What the MP seemed to be expressing was not just opposition to a particular policy move, but a broader sense of betrayal. His words carried emotional weight, especially when referencing border control. When he pointed to the surge in net migration, rising to nearly 1 million, it wasn't merely a statistical observation, it was an indictment. An accusation that despite promises of sovereignty and control, the systems meant to protect British interests had failed. And worse, in his view, had been allowed to fail through government complacency or quiet ideological drift. That message found sympathetic ears, particularly among working-class communities in the North and Midlands who voted for Brexit in hopes of change. For them, this wasn't just about trade deals or immigration numbers. It was about having control over their future. The irony that a government which had promised to take back control is now being accused of giving it away again is a powerful one. It reveals the fragility of political trust and the difficulty of navigating post-Brexit governance without alienating one side or another. While the MP's speech focused heavily on Starmer and Labour's potential course towards softer EU alignment, it also implicitly criticized the Conservative government's own handling of post-Brexit policy. By pointing to ongoing payments to the EU under the guise of administrative costs or targeted contributions, the MP challenged the narrative that Brexit had completely severed the financial ties that once rankled many voters. his acknowledgement.